As a BCBA working with children, specifically kids with autism, have you struggled to get through your initial assessments? With all the time it takes to do assessments, it's frustrating to not be able to get clients into services. That's where Frontera can help. Frontera is a HIPAA-compliant, AI-powered platform for ABA therapists and BCBAs who work with children with autism. Frontera was founded by Amal Deshpande, a successful entrepreneur and the parent of a child with autism. Frontera's team of clinicians and technologists use evidence-based research, powerful AI, and digital phenotyping at every stage of a child's journey with autism to provide insights and help improve outcomes. What does this mean in practical terms? I'll give you just one example. You can cut down the time it takes to complete initial client assessments from 8 to 10 hours to 3 to 4 hours. This saves time and lets you begin treatment and help your clients sooner rather than later. You can learn more and explore Frontera's easy-to-use assessment builder and diagnosis builder features at fronterahealth.com. Your first assessment report is free, and if you use code BOP25, you'll get an additional 5 assessments for just $100. So head to fronterahealth.com to check it out. Hey everyone, many years ago, a wise principal once told me that good instruction is the best classroom management tool teachers have at their disposal. In session 293, Dr. Todd Haydon joins me to discuss the practice of increasing the rate of students' opportunities to respond, which is an instructional practice that has indeed been shown to improve classroom behavior. In doing so, Todd and I dived deep into his dissertation work, which culminated in the study Haydon, Mancil, and Van Loan from 2009. The study began with a referral to help students who engaged in disruptive and off-task behaviors. And rather than conduct several individual FBAs, Todd and his colleagues coached the teacher to increase the rate of posing academic questions to the class. The results spoke for themselves and the rest is history. So tune in to learn how this practice works, and maybe it can be something that will help you in your practice. And by the way, he concludes the podcast with a very memorable story, so be sure to tune into the entire episode. And one more thing I suppose I'd mention is that there are extensive show notes over at behavioralobservations.com, more than usual, so go over there and check it out. And while you're there, sign up for the mailing list. You can get the show notes delivered right to your email inbox. There are about 5,000 people on the list already, and they get the show notes straight to their email. They don't even have to go to behavioralobservations.com. Unless, of course, they want CEUs. And in that case, if you're looking for CEUs, by all means, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs to see what we have to offer. We've got a bunch of stuff on classroom management as well as many other important topics in behavior analysis. And while we're doing plugs here, I want to let you know that we're brought to you by the Profound Autism Summit. It's a 2-day conference taking place on April 10th and 11th. The physical location is Boston, Massachusetts, but you can attend virtually. Following on the massive success of the 2024 summit, the 2025 event brings together leaders from areas of research, medicine, treatment, advocacy, and education to discuss the needs and support of those with profound autism across disciplines and throughout the lifespan. We're also brought to you by HRIC Recruiting. Cut out the middleman and speak directly with Barbara Voss, who's been placing BCBAs in great jobs all across the United States for about 15 years or more. We're also brought to you by the Behavioral Toolbox. We make a few references to it, especially the course When Not to FBA. We also have our course Motivational Interviewing, Getting Educator Buy-In. That's been getting great reviews as well. So go to thebehavioraltoolbox.com and see what we have to offer over there. And last but not least, we're brought to you by the Verbal Behavior Conference. So whether you attend in person in Austin, Texas, or online via Behavior Live, you're going to love this year's VBC. So go to behaviorlive.com, look up VBC or Verbal Behavior Conference. Again, go to the show notes for this episode for links to learn more about it. I hope to see you there. All right, that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to this fun conversation with Dr. Todd Haydon.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Todd Haydon, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How's it going today?
Thanks for having me, Matt.
My pleasure. We almost got into, as a podcaster who does interviews, sometimes in the pre-recording chat, I have to fight myself to get ahead of myself because we started almost to talk about the subject matter without hitting the record button. But what I was about to say to you is that you are the lead author on one of my favorite papers, Haydon, Mancil, and Van Loan, pardon me. And I want to get into why I think that paper is great. And I definitely want to hear the backstory about it. And the reason I like it so much is it's just a demonstration of such a useful concept of how instruction can drive improved behavior in classroom settings. And so not to kind of tease the audience unnecessarily, but we're going to get to all that and more and talk about the concept of opportunities to respond and other important classroom management strategies. But before we do that, though, I do want to get a little bit into you have an interesting backstory, at least from what I could tell from the materials you sent me ahead of time. I noticed that you were a music performance major. You had a background doing psychotherapy as an MSW and things like that. So if you can maybe give us a little bit of your background, how you got into ABA, perhaps it's through a circuitous route, I don't know, and then kind of take us up to what you're doing these days.
Yeah, it was. I had a music performance degree in classical guitar, and both my parents were professional musicians. And it seemed like there wasn't much behavior or ABA when I was growing up, but being around music performers, they were doing ABA, they just don't call it that. So when my mother taught me piano, she did a lot of shaping. She did a lot of task analysis, how to play scales and how to chain and learning music. And I played high school tennis and college tennis. It was the same thing, learning a skill, forehand serve, task analysis or whatever. I was applying and learning behavior principles. I just didn't know it. And then I actually, between doing the music stuff and going to graduate school, I had an interest in Eastern philosophy. So I went to India and I studied Eastern philosophy for about almost 4 years. And what I learned there was, of course, culture and different cultures, but how to look at behavior differently and maybe from a philosophical level. And so when I came back to the States, I saved up money to go to grad school and in social work. And in social work, we took classes on solution focused brief therapy and narrative therapy and good old psychodynamic therapy and behavior. And I remember doing like this short little study. It was called like a single subject design. And I didn't really know, this was in the mid 90s. So I didn't know what that really was in the context. And so when I graduated, I had all in systems theory and family therapy. That was like, it was really into systems theory and still am. And so when my first placement was a school for severe behavior disorders. And in that setting, we did this thing called the wraparound services, school-based and home-based. And I did that. I was in that setting for 2 years. And then I wanted to get more on the preventative side and became a social worker in an elementary school and then full-time in another elementary school. But the special ed director, he had this thing come to him called PBIS. And this would have been like 1997, 1998. And the statewide coordinator for Illinois, I was working in Illinois, I was appointed an internal PBIS coach. And we'd go up and learn from like Dr. Rob Horner and Dr. George Sugai and Dr. Jeff Colvin and eventually Dr. Terry Scott. And I just learned all these PBIS strategies. And I heard we were taught this thing called an FBA back in 1998. And when I learned how to not only do like a FBA, it changed my thinking. It just opened up a whole new world for me. And so I started thinking functionally. For example, a student would act out in class, come up into my office, we'd talk about the behavior and sort of like end the session with a 10-minute game of Uno or Jenga or whatever. And so when I started thinking functionally, I thought, well, maybe he's trying to escape work, but maybe he's also trying to come up to my office and just get attention. And maybe it's both. So what I started doing, I said to the teacher, I said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't he, I set a criterion for the week. He's coming up to my office anyway. Why don't we have him come up to my office if he completes his homework maybe 3 out of 4 nights out of the week? And so we started doing that. And then there was no behavior in that classroom. And we just come up and have fun and play. And then eventually we didn't have to do the intervention. He was okay behavior wise. And so FBA was like a big, big thing for me. And that's how I started learning about ABA. And in that setting, I also implemented like active supervision and pre-correction. I didn't know it was that, but in this morning gym setting, there was like 420 students there, and the people that were monitors, they quit. They all said, we can't handle the behavior. So they sent me in because I was an internal coach. And I just did these strategies of what I thought were common sense. You're not going to yell at the students and because to be quiet, that doesn't model good behavior. So I just made this sign that said, use self-control. And on the other side, inside voices. And we taught what self-control was. And anybody that was on task, I'd go around and use our little coin stickers. And that was actually my first publication, and kind of like a description of just keeping the office referrals as a dependent variable. And then I did some other things with PBAS. We had a radio show on Fridays as a school-wide reinforcement for the students and teachers. And then Dr. Terry Scott came, and we had a classroom of students with behavior disorders. And he said, and we consulted with him, and he came for several years. And so I had this relationship with him. And he said, well, for this classroom, why don't you have them all meet some kind of criterion? We'll do like as a group, and then they have some kind of reward. And what I didn't know, what he was telling me at that time, was he's doing group contingency, and it was an independent group contingency. And it worked. And they came up to my office like from 2:00 to 2:20. And we play games, Jenga, Uno, computer games, whatever. And I had the tabletop hockey set, and they would play that. And also, what I didn't know, but I was also putting them in HRE, happy, relaxed, engaged, and I did that as in therapy. So they had me present these findings of this intervention up at the state conference, and Dr. Scott was up there, and I had like a 20-minute time slot to describe the intervention. And then afterwards, there was dinner at Lucille Eber's house, and I was standing in the kitchen, just leaning against the wall with a beer in my hand. And Dr. Scott said, if you like this PBIS stuff, we have a grant that you can come down to the University of Florida and study. And it was in April, and I couldn't sell my house and move my family in a couple of months, but I took the next year to kind of prepare. And I moved down to Gainesville and started the special ed program at UF.
Imagine an event where experts from every field impacting profound autism come together. A one-stop shop for learning about topics from challenging behavior to catatonia, to sleep research, to the sibling experience. Join us for the Profound Autism Summit, a 2-day conference on April 10th and 11th in Boston, Massachusetts. We bring together top leaders in research, medicine, treatment, and advocacy to address the unique needs of individuals with profound autism across disciplines and throughout the lifespan. Register on Behavior Live or go to our website, profoundautismsummit.org. The summit provides a space for professionals, caregivers, and advocates to come together to learn from the experts, like Bridget Taylor, Peter Gerhardt, and Eric Larson. And you can earn continuing education credits. We're offering 22 BCBA CEs, 24 continuing education credits for psychologists, and our application for social work continuing education credits has been submitted. You can register for one day or both, but don't wait. Be part of the movement driving real change for people with profound autism. Remember, register on Behavior Live or go to our website, profoundautismsummit.org. See you at the summit.
At what point, because one of the things I want to ask you about is that amongst all these school-based interventions, I noticed in your Vita that you also provided, what we might consider psychotherapy and with, I guess, traditional patients or clients or what have you. I noticed that you did individual counseling for adults and marriage counseling or couples counseling and all sorts of things like that. We don't talk a lot about in behavior analysis too much. I'm wondering if there are any maybe lessons or insights that you gained from doing that work that either applied to your later work or might be helpful for audience members to learn about.
Yeah, there's, I think, more similarities between ABA and social work. So, for example, first, when you come in as a social worker, you have compassion. And it's almost like if you don't have compassion, you're not going to make it through the program if you don't have empathy. And so that's what we're starting to do in ABA with this, today's ABA and compassion over compliance. So that's very much an alignment. And when I've listened on the podcast, Pat Fryman's work, there's no such thing as bad boys, and that car seat example. I mean, that fits in with social work and direct practice, right there. And I remember on the show, I think he was talking about a student who came in and not much happened, but he was there listening to the student. And in social work, empathic listening, that's, or providing attention, as we call it in ABA, that can go a long way. I did that with in the last school I was working with. There was a student I saw in the entire year, and when he'd have kind of like what needed a process, like a breakup with a girlfriend or problems at the group home, it wasn't so much that I suggested interventions. I was just always there for him and just listened to him. And I thought, am I helping this person? Where's the outcomes? Where's the measurable goals? And at the end of the year, he came in and said, Dr. Haydon, I just want to thank you. You helped me so much. And can I give you a hug? You were there for me. It's like, wow, I wouldn't have expected that. And so like, I guess you could say the social validity of whatever I was doing, just listening with empathy and saying, yeah, that's a tough situation, was huge for that student. So there's a lot of similarities. There's a few differences, like in family therapy, we talk about triangulation, not in data triangulation, but getting caught in a situation. So, if you go into a school and you're there and there may be some conflict between a teacher and a student, and maybe the teacher is having trouble with the student or the student is having trouble with the teacher, and then you come in, you can easily be put into like the hero mode. Like, you need to fix this. So we call that in social work the hero mode. And the student could be the persecutor and the teacher could be the victim, or the teacher could be the victim, or vice versa. The teacher could be the persecutor and the student could be the victim, as far as that's the way they're sharing with you. And the consultant could easily get, sucked into that dynamic. And then they also, what happens like in family therapy is sometimes the student or the child in the family setting will act out so that the focus can be on him and not on the parents. So I don't know if you remember the movie Good Will Hunting.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's one of my favorite movies. He talks, there's a scene in the, when he's talking to Robin Williams, Matt Damon's character, and they're talking about how Matt Damon would act out so his father would hit him. And there was like a scene where it's like, did you choose the belt or the wrench? And I chose the wrench or something. So that's an example of how you can avoid he was trying to protect his mother by acting out. So he would take the whooping rather than the mother. And so that's a concept that we call triangulation. There's also some concepts that are psychodynamic that I find really, really helpful. And I thought, well, should I talk about psychodynamic theory? And then I was reading Science of Human Behavior the other day, and I think it's on page 12. where Skinner talks about how science is a set of attitudes. And then further down, he's talking about philosophical doubt. And then he talks about, we can thank Sigmund Freud for the concept of wishful thinking. So
all right,
I thought, wow, he's thanking Freud. That's great. That's why I like Skinner so much. He's so open-minded. So there's this idea of transference and countertransference, and that's really important to know, that whether we're working with a student or a teacher, they're bringing what I would call their learning history, their history of reinforcement with a particular, person that you may remind them of or not remind them. So they can idealize you and think you're great, or they can say, oh, I don't like this guy. And if you dug deeper, it could be because you remind them of somebody in the past that, they had a negative experience with. And the other side is the countertransference, that we have to check our feelings about how when we're working with the student or with the teacher. Are we getting frustrated? Does this remind us of any of our upbringing, our history of school experience? So those are really important to be aware. But then the similarity is, what I'm basically talking about is just in how we enact acceptance commitment therapy, we use self as context. So we're self-aware and we're observing this process. So again, there's kind of like a bridge there. And then in therapy, when we talk about transactional analysis, it's a type of therapy where the person, the individual, in their private events in their world, we have the parent, adult, and child. And the parent can be divided into a loving parent or critical parent. And the adult is that part of us which I would say is what follows rule-governed behavior. We're doing things that we're supposed to do. We get up on time. We show up to work. We're being professional. We're implementing evidence-based practices. And then there's the inner child, which is playful, but can also be a little bit whiny. And then there's the inner teenager, which can be rebellious. And so when I'm working with a student, I try to align all those things. So like my loving parent is compassionate. My adult is doing what I'm supposed to be doing as far as evidence-based practices, doing the right strategy. And my inner child is playing with the other child, especially if they're young. Like if we're in the sandbox and we're playing kinetic sand and talking, all those things are lined up. So my inner child and my adult and my loving parent are all with that child. And that's, to me, when I'm in HRE and the students is in HRE.
Meaningful change in schools starts with true buy-in from teachers and leaders. But resistance is real. Overloaded with initiatives, educators often feel unheard and overwhelmed. Our online course, Motivational Interviewing, Getting Educator Buy-in, empowers you to create genuine collaboration. Learn to build trust, align with their values, and inspire lasting commitment, not just compliance. Ready to transform engagement? Enroll now at thebehavioraltoolbox.com.
Wow, those are some really helpful analogies. And I think anyone who does any type of consultation, but particularly school-based consultation, I think will resonate with a lot of those points. I appreciate that, especially the notion that, am I reminding the teacher of, someone or vice versa and things like that. And right. I think anyone in any educational setting has a list of names that they will never name their own child, because of
right.
some of those things, so
right.
And then convert the reverse is probably true. So
and even there's one more thing I thought of is
sure.
There's a narrative therapy, which I'm really fond of. And they talk about, the same thing as like Pat Fryman talks about, there's no such thing as bad boys. And the child comes to you with the problem. The child is not the problem. The problem is the problem. And there's a process we use where it's called externalizing the problem. So you take the problem from internalizing it to externalize it, and you start getting the child or even adult to have a relationship to the problem and asking problems. So there's a famous case study that Michael White did. He's the co-founder of narrative therapy, and a child was smearing poop on the wall and behind the couch and hiding it. So they came up collectively and collaboratively with this kid. They called it sneaky poo. And then you ask questions. There's a training in what type of questions to ask so the child can externalize the problem. And eventually you got, the child to see when sneaky poo would happen, when he didn't happen, and the poop smearing, stopped.
I see. So am I understanding correctly? So that in using this type of nomenclature, that they were able to talk about the repertoire almost independently of the child.
Yes.
Is that okay? All right.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. Really cool. A lot of what you're just talking about too reminds me. I read a book a few years ago called Clinical Interviewing, and I think it was written by professors of social work somewhere. And I'll put the reference. I'll find the reference in the show notes and put it in there. And it excuse me, it hit a lot of the themes you're talking about, and it also had some really good stuff in there about the process that you need to go through in order to finally provide some, what you might consider advice or direction or suggestions or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is almost like the last part of, it's like it's multiple links of the chain in after establishing rapport and, learning about the issue and things like that. And they had this whole section on advice giving and like how careful that, people in a therapeutic environment have to be before, it's basically how do you get permission to give advice? You just, the whole thing is fascinating. It's probably worth a whole podcast unto itself because I thought, and it really blended in with a lot of motivational interviewing stuff. So again,
yes,
I'll put the link in the show notes for that book, but I just found it really profound.
And in narrative therapy, we actually ask permission. Can I make a suggestion, or can I write this down as I'm taking notes so that's just full disclosure? This is what I'm writing. Can I have your permission to write this down?
Yep. I've used that strategy myself with parents when I interview them for in school consultation. I usually do it in some sort of self-deprecating way. Like, look, do you mind if I take my computer out? I promise I'm paying attention. I just know that if I don't write these things down, I'm not going to remember it, and I want to help you as best I can, And so so I learned a lot from that process, and asking permission to even take notes was one of those. I guess I hate to call it a hack because I don't want to demean it, but I found it very helpful. So, hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. Great foundation because I think that it's great foundation because what we're going to do is talk about more actionable, or I guess more, what we do when we do want to provide suggestions to help people deal with disruptive behavior in school settings. So, so let's talk about opportunities to respond. And I'll, as I mentioned at the outset, that this came onto my radar many years ago when I was doing a deep dive into, a lot of the PBIS literature, particularly the, kind of like the tier 1 and tier 2 type of interventions, the lesser intensive interventions for, problem behaviors that aren't dangerous, but are chronic and disruptive and just kind of detract from the overall environment and interrupt learning and things like that. And what I've found out over the years of consulting in schools is that so many times I have gotten a referral to do an FBA for a child and or a student, and I go into the classroom and there's so many other things that we need to do before we even start talking about an individualized intervention. And so that sent me down the tier 1 and tier 2 rabbit hole. And one of the papers that I came across years ago was Haydon, Mancil, and Manlone, and this whole concept of opportunities to respond. And I found it, so helpful. I actually have a whole segment talking about that study in the course that my colleagues and I created called "When Not to FBA," that folks have probably heard about on previous episodes. So it a lot of the data that you guys reported we used to share this concept. So for those of us who are for audience members who have no idea what we're talking about, let's maybe just start with some terminology. What is an opportunity to respond? And also, when did this become something that was salient to you? When did you realize, oh, this is an important metric? So if we can maybe start from there, then we can get into the study itself.
So when I started doing my doctoral studies, I was interested in tier 2, tier 1, just like you were talking about. And I was interested in this check-in, check-out because I did that in the schools. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to narrow this down. I'm kind of interested in classroom research. And so we had our first semester, we could fool around and just kind of look at what we were doing. And then in the second semester, I just came across this study that it was called Opportunities to Respond, and by Kevin Sutherland. And I believe Joe Webby was on there too. Maybe not. But he used Opportunities to Respond in a self-contained classroom with behavior disorders. And I thought, oh, that's when I used to go around in school and look at the different classrooms, and I come in and do my social skills or whatever. I noticed that some teachers asked a lot of questions, and they'd sit up there in the front of the room sitting on a table with their legs hanging off and asking the students the questions. And then I noticed that in those rooms, because I was doing SWIS, the school-wide information system. I noticed in those rooms, there was less referrals coming out than the teachers that didn't ask as many questions. And I saw, oh, they're more engaged. So when I read that article, I thought, that's it. That's what I want to study. And then that's how I got interested into Opportunities to Respond, which is Opportunities to Respond is just a teacher academic question, as opposed to just a teacher question like, how are you doing? How was your weekend? It's a question that wants to get a response, an active student response from the student that has to do with academic content.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. So let's get into the study itself. There's the pseudonym of the participant is Bree, and one of the things that I'll just give a quick rundown for folks, and obviously you can fill in all the blanks that I'll leave. But the idea was that you guys got referred to support a classroom with this student who was engaging in disruptive behavior, whose pseudonym is Bree, and I want to know. I have so many questions about this. That's why I'm so grateful for this conversation. But I'm curious, so Bree had some disruptive behavior. She was also off task, and when she was on task, she was not making a lot of correct responses. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay. So what was the context for the referral? And more importantly, what made you want to use the intervention that you did, which I'll let you describe, rather than a traditional, like, why not put her on a check-in, check-out plan or point-based, which is a point-based reward system for those who aren't familiar with that term,
Right.
or do some other type of, kind of more thorough FBA and individualized intervention. So can you walk us through the backstory of how you got involved in this case and some of the decisions for intervention that you made and why you made them?
Right. So the backstory is we were taking a class as part of the grant. This would be my second year in the fall. And we were studying Murray Sidman's Tactics of Scientific Research and also Don Baer's Small Matter of Proof. And those are the texts we were reading. And Dr. Maureen Conroy, brilliant researcher, it was just Mancil and Van Loan were in the class with a couple others. And she suggested, to really learn about what Sidman's saying, you should do a study. So I thought, okay, I want to do a study and I'm interested in OTR. And although when I went into the classroom, I didn't think I'd necessarily doing the OTR, but so that school was something that we had some relationship with. And I just emailed the principal and I said, do you mind if we do is there a teacher that needs some classroom management tweaks? And she said, sure, and referred me to that student. It was interesting. So the first time I go into the classroom, I'm walking down the hall and this teacher who is considered like the best, lead teacher in the classroom, she's doing choral responding and things are getting, kind of loud in there, but they're all actively engaged. And the principal wanted, pretty much everybody to do choral responding, which is like, you don't see that a lot. And so I went in the classroom and Sidman talks about doing a pilot study. So someone is like, okay, I want to do a pilot study and to tweak my dissertation. But I went in and I saw, we do this and we get permission and show the IRB. And there was maybe 3 students in that classroom, but Bree was the one that brought back the permission form to do the study. And I thought, well, that says something right there about the family and the support that gives me a lot of information just in getting it back.
Okay, so let me stop you there just so I'm understanding the context. So there were multiple kids in the classroom who had challenging behaviors, but Bree's data were reported because of the family provided consent for that.
Right.
Okay, so it wasn't just intervening. For the purposes of the study and the research protocol and the ethics associated with those practices, yes, we're focusing on Bree, but there were multiple individuals who, and I'm speculating here and tell me if I'm wrong, but who maybe passively participated in this by dint of being in the classroom during these instructional tweaks. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'd say there's a couple. We did the SSBD and the teacher, nominated like three students. So there's maybe 2 others. I can't quite remember, but 2 or 3 others that could have used some kind of intervention. And so I asked the teacher, well, when does the problem occur the most? And he said, well, during instruction time. So it just lined up perfectly that it was during instruction. Had it been like another time, then I wouldn't have used OTR. But it's just a perfect storm kind of thing where it was during instruction and he needed instruction support. And that's how I introduced this idea of OTR. And then, we learn, and Dr. Scott taught me this, is that in the classroom, always check the academic behavior with the behavior that your problem. They're so connected. Like if you think about the triangle in P by S, you cut it down the middle, and on the left side is academics, and the right side is behavior. They're interconnected. So that's when I started saying, okay, let's start collecting data.
Hey everyone, this is the last break of the podcast, and we're going to make it count because it's for the Verbal Behavior Conference, the 2025 version. Please join us for the 8th annual VBC. It's March 27th and 28th. The conference will be hybrid. and hosted in person at the Commons Conference Center at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. And of course, it'll be brought to you live streamed through the magic of Behavior Live. The mission of the VBC is to highlight, support, and mentor practitioners and researchers who utilize the theoretical, practical, and empirical information about verbal behavior in their professions. The conference is organized and hosted each year by the Central Texas Autism Center and its founder, Kelly Rich. This year, we're proud to have Dr. Pat McGreevy, Dr. Tiffany Kodak, Dr. Judah Axe, Dr. April Kaisamore Hunter, Dr. Barbara Esch, and Dr. Kyle Miguel as speakers. And on March 26th, the day before the conference, there's a full pre-conference workshop from the aforementioned Barbara Esch. So go to behaviorlive.com/VBC to learn more, or just go to the show notes for this episode. I hope to see you there. Because I'm familiar with this, I kind of want to be careful here and I want to be careful not to leave the audience behind. And I will put a link to the article in the show notes, and if I'll probably maybe cut and paste some of the data, some of the graphs too, so folks can follow along. So if you're listening to this and you're interested, go to behavioralobservations.com and check the show notes out there. But so I guess from the baseline perspective, the teacher had pretty low rates of OTR, right? And I've been in some classrooms as a consultant, and again, since learning about this, it's always been something I've noticed. I've tried to pay attention to if I'm trying to figure out what's going on. How low were the OTRs? And not just maybe from a data standpoint, because we can all look to the graph, but how did it feel? Was it like excruciatingly slow? Did the kids have long periods of time where they weren't, engaged and things like that? Because I mean, those are sometimes things that I see, particularly in settings where teachers, struggle with this sort of thing.
Yeah, it wasn't excruciating, but it was low.
Mm-hmm.
But you could see that not many people were on task. Most of the class too.
Okay, and then tell me about how you broached the intervention with the teacher.
So I said, "Do you want to work something during instruction?" He said, "Yes." I said, "It seems like, yeah, we could work on something like that." And he had all the material. He probably could have had some, like he maybe have been an artist on the side, because he had like this beautiful drawing it was a black chalkboard back then he was teaching science. And I just kind of remember like flowers and stamens and, whatever. It was kind of like if you've ever seen Key and Peele, the substitute teacher, the first one, where he plays Mr. Garvey. And in the backboard, I think it's like human biology, but it was like that. It was like all the information was there. And so I said, well, why don't we just, he was reading questions off a piece of paper, but also I said, why don't we read, questions off the board? And that really got him buy-in, because he had spent all this time making this beautiful across, the whole classroom, this board that you could say, what is this? What do you call this? What do you call this? And then he would read off his paper. So it was very easy to increase his opportunities to respond, because I was already using his existing mode of instruction. And it took like the whole conversation took about a half an hour, but the actual training, I showed him videos of people doing like corresponding, and we practiced for a little bit. I explained the idea, I explained the idea of a learning trial, and then he just, practiced in front of me for like 5 minutes. And okay, that's like 3 opportunities to respond per minute. That's 15, a little bit over. We're good to go. Let's implement it.
Cool. I'm wondering that seems like almost an ideal situation where you have the material prepared, you have a teacher who's willing to alter their practice and do something that they're not familiar with and things like that. I'm curious, have you encountered scenarios where the opposite is true, where, because I one of the things that occurred to me is sometimes what occurs to me when I'm working with teachers is that if I'm asking them to increase opportunities to respond, I'm also asking them to change their practice, to, exert more response effort, et cetera, et cetera. Have you encountered those scenarios as well? And are there things that you've learned in this process to overcome some of those barriers? And we'll get back to the study itself, but I just want to.
I haven't, because, I didn't have to change a whole lot with that teacher. He was just going at a faster pace at the mode of instruction. So another study that we did in, I think it was 2011, the way I increased the opportunities to respond is that the teacher was using an overhead projector and using multiple choice questions. So during baseline, she'd ask a question, ask another question individually, and then she would also maybe read off a text or whatever. And I said, why don't we use the overhead projector, and for each question, you ask the question, and that's the right question. So that's one opportunity to respond. And I said, let's say if C was correct, for A, B, and D, why don't you just say, why is A wrong? Why is B wrong? Why is D wrong? So right there, it kind of got 4 opportunities to respond in one question. If there's 10 questions, that's 40 opportunities to respond right there.
Oh, that's clever. I like that. Okay. That's really useful. I'm going to steal that, Todd. So thank you. Getting back to the original study, were the high OTR condition, the intervention, were those chorally based responses that you had that the teacher engage in? So
yes.
And were the baseline and the return to baseline conditions, because it was an ABA design for folks who haven't read the paper, were those more single student responses?
Those were choral responding. So that was just doing it at a lower rate, because he was trying to do it based on the school.
Got it. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. You mentioned that. Okay. I got it now. All right.
Which is unusual, because usually it's single student responding.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And the rate of 3 was just from the literature, where some people, it was one paper, I think it was Diane Sinato, she used at least 3 opportunities to respond. So I thought, okay, let's make the response effort low. Let's just do 3 opportunities to respond, the minimum that the literature says, rather than do like 5. And let's go from there. And so let's not make them do 5 or whatever, and just do 3. And so that's how we got the minimum of 3 that you see, a criterion on that graph.
Okay. All right. And just, I'm going off of memory here, but just for those who haven't read the paper, I believe the baseline rate was about 1 per minute, or less than 1 OTR per minute, and then you guys bumped it up to 3.
Yeah.
And then, I assume it's, in the return to baseline, you just told them to kind of go business as usual, right? And then it kind of, now, did you have to, just out of curiosity, I always, because I imagine there's probably some naturally reinforcing aspects of the reduction in problem behavior. Did he need coaching to return to baseline? Because I'm imagining that, like, if this new practice of a higher OTR is yielding all these benefits, lower disruptive behavior, more on task time, more correct responding, et cetera, I don't know. I'm just curious.
I think I told him a little bit. Yeah, just, go back to baseline and just do what you're doing before. And I think on the graph, though, you'll see that his OTR started at the end creeping up a little bit from 1. I have to look at it again, but.
All right. Yeah. So thus far, we've talked about what was going on with the teacher. So tell us about some of the dependent measures you had for Bree.
So is on task and disruptive, and then correct responses, because I wanted to see how the worked academically, and her correct responses went up. And I kind of was too stringent on the criteria to meet a correct response, because it was my first study. So I thought, okay, I got to make sure it's, spot on, internal validity and whatever. So the criteria is that she had to get all the words correct, which is, so if she left off maybe one word, but it was really, she got the concept, you could tell, I count it as a correct response. So the correct responses would be actually higher than what the data show.
Okay.
And if you look at it one way.
Got it. So disruptive behavior, I think, virtually went away, and on task, I think, doubled from like 33 to 66%, and then and incorrect responding also went up. So, and then everything went away with the return to baseline. So it, again, is very logical. Did you guys run into like a scheduling problem or something like that in terms of not being able to do the return to, do the B? Because I know, I have some thoughts on that, but I want you to.
The last data point was right before Christmas break. And then, Dr. Conroy just said, well, you could go back in, but let's just do it as an ABA design. And which kind of shows, like in the school, it's getting towards Christmas break and this intervention still worked during that time.
What I really appreciate about studies like this one and some of the others in this, in the school psychology literature that is behaviorally based, is that they report data from people's master's work and doctoral work and things like that. And it's real life. It's not just, it's not something that's occurring at, an R1 research university and things like that. So the idea that there's, not the B and what we'd all love to see the AB design, it's like, well, real life happened and it wasn't possible to do the next phase of the study, but the data are important nonetheless, certainly. And then perhaps there are other ways we can, corroborate whether the independent variable caused the changes in the dependent variable. But, there's another study that, a couple other, like the, Campbell and Skinner study on the timely transitions game. If I recall the study correctly, the teacher didn't want to do a reversal because because the intervention was so effective. They're like, no thanks. I'll just stick with the improved behavior.
I think it's an AB design, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know that study.
Yeah, it's a classic. And I talk about that study a lot, and I actually put it in the course I mentioned earlier too. Not to make this an infomercial about when not to FBA, but I love that study because of that. Because of of its imperfections and the social validity of the teacher saying, "Yeah, I'm going to stick with this because this is so darn effective." And so anyway, maybe this is more of a commentary on the, so folks whose exposure to behavior analytic research is more in the Java world and the behavioral interventions world and things like that. There's a whole other universe of school psychology type of behavior analytic work, much of which that you've participated in journals like, School Psychology Review, Education and Treatment of Children, the Journal of Positive Behavioral Supports. I can go on and on, but there's a whole world out there for school, for research in these types of settings for folks who might not be aware of that. So I always like to mention that whenever I have the opportunity to also. All right. So since this study has been published, what else has been learned about using OTRs or manipulating opportunities to respond in these sorts of settings? What is the current state of the literature or understanding about how, using this as a tool has evolved perhaps since those earlier studies?
Well, if I just follow my line of research real quickly, is that the next study I did was comparing the three types with the choral, the mixed, and the individual. And that suggestion came out of a paper that Paul Sindelar did, who was on my doctoral committee. It was a suggestion by Rosenstein and Stevens, who were at the University of Illinois Champaign, that to do this mixed responding at 70-30. And so a few years ago, that study, my dissertation was replicated and it got similar results, but with two people. They didn't quite control the opportunities to respond as I did it in my dissertation. I was pretty much spot on with 5. We chose 5 per minute because with if you do like 3 individual response, we had to keep everything the same as far as the rate. So the rate is something that research can continue to look at, keeping the rate but the same, but the mode different. And so then we did another study where I did, again, single students responding with unison, with just using fingers, So that, using response cards or fingers or verbal, that is a good research trend to make it easy on the teacher. Is it A, B, C, or D with the four fingers, or thumbs up, thumbs down. So that's a line of research. And then I compared choral responding with using a mnemonic device. So I started using choral responding, adding things on, and the choral responding plus mnemonic had better outcomes than just choral responding by itself.
Be an example of that. Can you describe that a little bit more?
So like you live in New Hampshire, right?
I sure do. Yeah.
Yeah. So the mnemonic to learn New Hampshire was hamster, and they'd show a little hamster up on the state.
Okay.
But students would chorally respond that. So they did that with all the states. And so we did on task, and I think it was on task and maybe correct responses. And then we did a delayed recall test, and the mnemonic plus the choral responding showed improvement there. So choral responding could be used combined, And then so we did that, and then I did opportunities to respond, but peer led. So in the literature and in around the 2010s, we started talking about, this is teacher led OTR. What if we did peer OTR? So we did a study with that where we just did numbered heads together, which is a form of cooperative learning, which is a great strategy for, cooperative learning and group learning, and combine that with peer opportunities to respond. So that showed a lot of promise there, combining those. And then I did a study. This is a little bit more complicated. There's a lot of backstory on that, but comparing simultaneous prompting, or zero time delay, just giving, or errorless learning, just giving the answer, and that was effective too. And lately they're trying to they've done studies with like bug in the ear and increasing OTR. And one study just came out this morning. I got an alert where they did performance feedback through asynchronous module and email as far as feedback. So it just came out like an hour ago, hour and a half ago in remedial and special education. So I'll go read that, see what they're doing. So that's kind of like where we're at. It seems to come and go like every 10 years, this OTR stuff. I did like a history of, I think I was one of how did this OTR stuff begin? Where did it begin? Who was doing it? And so in my research and doing the history of it, I came through this whole thread of OTRs. Where did it begin?
Yeah, there's okay, cool. So it sounds like there's a lot of variations of it, and you still finding that the outcomes are robust. So, so maybe with our, I guess, remaining time here, Todd, I'd like to talk about, maybe broaden the lens a little bit and just talk about your, the types of things you look for when you're asked to consult with teachers and classroom management more generally. So we've kind of focused on OTRs and in combination with choral responding. But in a more general sense, when, if you get a call from a principal and say, look, Mr. Jones or whatever, or whoever it might be, is really struggling with this third grade class. They're running roughshod over him, and there's all sorts of things going on, and so on and so forth. Can you go in and take a look, and, let's say they engage in some consultation to help turn things around. What are some of the, I guess, broad things that you're looking for from, from maybe a first principles perspective when you step into that setting?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a little skewed because I've been from like 2017 to last year. I was in a school one day a week. So I could build those relationships with teachers and they knew me. But so the relationship is important, like we talked about earlier, as a consultant going in with the teacher. And what I look for is probably like three things. I look at the academics and the behavior. What's the teacher's teaching style? And is there any improvement there? Do they need to have any improvement? Do they want any improvement? And then I look at the teacher-student relationship. and the student relationship with the teacher. And that came out of just doing therapy with students where they talk about, oh, I really like this teacher. I don't like this teacher. And so that's going to play a dynamic in the intervention. And then I'd look at the overall classroom management as like, how's the teacher relating to the group? And then how are the peers relating to each other? So you can have a great teacher, great instruction, but the peers aren't getting along. So if the peers aren't getting along, there you can do your group contingencies. You can do numbered heads together. You can do positive praise notes. You can do tootling. Speaking of Campbell and Skinner, Christopher Skinner came up with tootling, which is the opposite of tattling.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the problem we did a study with tootling and it really, really worked. I have to get on publishing that data, but it's good data, and it's tootling in a classroom with where the peers. The teacher was great. So it depends on what aspect of classroom management. I kind of looked at that, and then I go in and do the intervention based on that.
Got it. And real quick, you mentioned this term numbered heads together. Can you describe what that is?
So numbered heads together is kind of like the good behavior game where you split up students into heterogeneous groups and you assign them a number, like each one gets 1 to 4, and maybe there's like 4 groups of 4. And you ask a question, which is good, like an opportunity to respond. And then you'd say, have them write it down. It's good to have like either, pre-printed cards or response cards or fingers. And you'd say, pull out of the hat. Okay, I want all 2s to raise their answer. And so, and they're, more importantly, as a group, they're coming up with the answer. So they're talking. And so I did a study with that with good results. And the only thing is that needs to be done in that research is try to get in there and see, what are they talking about? But that's what number heads together does. Okay. It helps with opportunities to respond. It helps keep the students engaged and while they're processing the answer. And then if someone who is hesitant about answering, going back to Bree, what I felt was she wasn't just, she knew she knew the material. She just didn't have the confidence to call out. So, which can be a downside of co-responding, is that you have to make sure you give wait time so the student is responding in with everybody else. There's not like the students are responding and then she's copying, imitating, like almost a co-op behavior. It's got to be at the same time. That's when you know that she is the teacher's the prompt, the question is the prompt, not the peer's answers. So that's what number heads together does. It helps with that. Maybe the student didn't get the answer, but if you call them, then they've all come up with the answer. So you're just like, okay, this is what the group said.
Okay, so you're more reporting out.
You're reporting out.
Got it.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right. So last couple of questions here for you, Todd. And maybe we've already talked about some of these things already, but you have mentioned things like using behavior-specific praise and active supervision and things like that. Are there other, for lack of a better word, pieces of low-hanging fruit that a lot of behavior analysts like miss training on? I know school work in general, I think, is that type of training is tough to get for people in today's ABA programs because it's very much autism focused, and most of the people in our field are intervening in those settings, homes, clinics, etc. But but more generally, are there other aspects that you'd like to see people get more training on as they come through these ABA programs?
Well, there's the PAX, PAX, good behavior game. Des Embry, he has these what he calls kernels. Do you know him?
Gotten some email correspondence from him.
Okay.
So, yes.
He's a great guy. He came to our university and did some training. I did the implementation of PAX one year when we had the funding for it. But there's this, uses spleens, but which is basically a redirection, but without any negative association to it. But he has this little card that just has a thumbs up green and thumbs up down, okay, not okay. And that can be, I've used that in my class, and you just go around and in combination with like active supervision, walking around, but just say, oh, this is, okay, not okay. So that's another kind of like a low hanging fruit that you can do along with behavior specific praise.
Very cool. And again, I'll put some references in the notes for folks who want to dig into any of these topics in a little bit more detail. So,
one thing about OTR though is OTR. There can be a ceiling effect, and Stevens and Rosenscheid talk about that. So eventually, OTR, because there might be some resistance to OTR with teachers. And so in social work, we say there's never resistance. There's feedback. And so in the context of OTRs, it's during the acquisition phase and during the fluency phase. And when fluency, you're just trying to acquisition, you're trying to get the correct response. And then with the fluency, you're trying to be accurate with a certain amount of time. And then mastery is then when you don't need the OTRs. They're responding, they've already mastered it. And then you can generalize it to different settings. And then adaptability, where you start becoming creative. And some teachers, they want to start the creative point when the student hasn't done the acquisition fluency phase and mastery. So OTRs need to be put in context. And Stephen and Rosenstein even say that there's a ceiling effect of OTRs.
Got it.
In one study that we did when it was ABAB, and during the second intervention phase, now these were math students who wouldn't even come to the table. And then so we were doing the simultaneous prompting procedure, and at the middle of the second intervention phase, they said, "Why are you giving us the answers? We want to answer." It's like, oh my gosh. But we had to continue the study. But it's like they want to learn. How amazing is that? They want to answer. And so the ceiling point of, that's when I would have done a different intervention, but it was a study, so I had to finish the study.
I see. All right. Well, so many things to consider for school-based practitioners, and I think there's a lot of lessons for folks working in any environment too, just in terms of how to gain cooperation and rapport and develop rapport with stakeholders more generally. So lots of good stuff that you brought to the podcast today, Todd. I really appreciate it. So I'd like to wrap up here. If there are any final thoughts that you have on this topic or anything else, and would you have any advice for the newly minted behavior analyst or a behavior analyst at perhaps any training level?
This for newly minted is when I'm fairly new minted as a BCBA, it's 2021, although I've been doing research since 2006. I felt proud when I got that paper, when I passed. And I was probably just as proud of getting that paper and getting certified as when I got my PhD. So I'd say feel proud, hasten slowly, go and learn, but take your time and find a area that you feel that really clicks with you, that you want to do. And pursue that. And whether it's one, maybe eventually start your own business or consulting one day or whatever. And if you're been in the field for a while, and if you're thinking about research, don't be afraid of, if there is any fear about getting a PhD, it can be done. I feel if anybody's got their certificate, they can get a PhD. And then I guess the last thing is find out your why. Why are you doing why are you doing this? What's your story? Everyone has a story. Actually, I was introduced to ABA even before graduate school. There's this little boy. He was referred for speech and language services because he couldn't say his R's. He was born with extra ligaments on the bottom of his mouth, so he supposedly couldn't roll up and say R. So he went to speech and language service, and it was down in a basement. And the speech and language, I don't know if she knew ABA, but the first thing she did was a preference assessment. And so the little boy chose like a little toy car. And then she had set up this system where if he got close to saying R, he didn't have to say it exactly, like an approximation. she would put this little ball down this little contraption, and it would go down. You get a token, and if he got the certain amount of tokens, he would get the car. So she explained this during the first session, and then it practiced a little at the end. The second session, he practiced for the whole time, and the third session, somewhere in the middle of the third session or so, he said R, and the speech and language person said, "What? Say it again." And the little boy said, "R." Say it again, R, R. And so all the people from there was one-way mirror that came out, and she said, "Say it to him, R. Say it to her, R." He's like, practice opportunities is fun, and generalization, say it, R. And this boy just kept saying R and R. And then she said, "Let's go upstairs." And they got in the elevator, and the Beatles song, Let It Be, was playing. They're going up, and then she goes, "Say it to this secretary, R." And this person was on the elevator and getting on the elevator. "Excuse me, sir, this little boy learned how to say R. Can you say R? R." And there's this woman, R. And the parents were just so pleased that this little boy learned how to say his R's. And this little boy has maintained that R behavior for like 50 years. I know, because I was that little boy.
Super cool. Very cool. Great story. So I'll share a little bit of, podcast prep behind the curtain. I always tell guests, if you have a cool story, make sure you know how to occasion it, or let me know how I can occasion it during the podcast. And boy, did you deliver, Todd. So that was very cool. Where can folks find you if they want to learn more about the work that you do?
Todd.Haydon@uc.edu. That's my email.
Okay. And I'll put that in the show notes as well. So, all right, Todd, thanks for closing out with just a banger of a story and lots of great content leading up to it.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.